everybody, and welcome back to the Legal Weekly Wine, where hot news is uncorked. Today, we are talking about a lot of Supreme Court activity. We're going to talk about the second round at the Supreme Court level of the case of A.A.R.P. These are initials, not the organization, versus Donald Trump. And this is regarding the Alien Enemies Act and the right to deport Venezuelans to another country under the Alien Enemies Act. This is round two, and it was a fairly monumental decision by the Supreme Court on May 16th of 2025. So we're going to discuss that, what it means, what the justices hold, break that down a little bit. We're also going to talk about the Supreme Court just yesterday on May 19th. So back-to-back orders, lifting the temporary deportation protections, ending the temporary protected status for some Venezuelans through the country that Biden had enacted and then extended before the leave of his presidency. We also are going to talk today about the Qatar plan. With the Qatar plane. So if you want to hear about the plane issue and whether Trump should be able to take it under the Constitution, we're going to be pulling out big words like the Emoluments Clause from the Constitution to also determine whether this act of accepting a plane from Qatar is a violation of the Constitution by Donald Trump. So we're going to get into, these are our main three cases that we're going to discuss and issues, but we'll throw a few others in along the way. Good morning and good afternoon for those of you who are doing happy hour with us. I'm Virginia Tarani. I am the owner and attorney for Tarani Law, LLC, based in Maryland, doing business in Maryland, D.C., and Virginia, because you never need a lawyer. Tell you do. I'm also joined by Dr. John Weil, the Dean of the Honors College at Middle Tennessee State University, who is an expert in the U.S. Constitution, constitutional law, and the amending process. Welcome back.
Good to be here.
Okay, so we're going to start with, since we're in the morning, we're normally drinking some kind of coffee or caffeinated beverage. For those of you in the afternoon, join us, grab a glass of wine and join us. This is the Legal Weekly Wine, but today I've got a caffeinated beverage, an ode to Chelsea, who was with us for so long at the Law Unscripted and the Legal Weekly Wine. Hopefully we'll get her back for a visit. But in the meantime, I'm drinking Peach Vibe, which is a Celsius flavor with some good caffeine. Dr. Weil, what are you joining us with?
Well, I can't seem to get it on my screen, but I have it. There we go.
There it is. Oh, something blue.
Mountain Berry Blast sports drink.
Okay.
Sports, that's all about me, right?
Oh, yes. The definition of
I
who
walk
you are
up
and what
down
you
steps
do.
2 or 3 times a day. That's
to the car and back. Yeah.
right.
Well, you know, it's got some electrolytes, something to keep you going.
It does.
All right, so we're gonna hop right into it because we have quite a few things to discuss, and these are very hot topics, the hottest legal topics of the week. We continue. I tell you, I never thought in all of my years of practice, almost 20 years now, that I would be talking so much about immigration. Due process, absolutely. And I know that due process is a key fundamental to immigration law. But this year, as soon as Donald Trump took power, all of a sudden, with his platform, he ran on a deportation immigration platform. And sure enough, his promises are coming true. And that is one of the focuses of his administration. And you know, there are good and bad in this. And a lot of people are very happy with the way that it's headed. A lot of people are very upset. I'm in the sense of, if we're providing due process and the way that the immigration process and procedure should work, then sure, let's make sure our timelines are held. Let's make sure the process is working. We focus on it more, make sure people aren't slipping through the cracks. But to me, as an attorney and as someone who is very strict on the law and its meaning, this due process is fundamental. And Dr. Weil, you're one of the first people who even taught me that. As my constitutional law professor more than 20 years ago, back at MTSU, you were one of the first to teach me about due process.
And you know what's fascinating, if you watch the arguments, is the Trump administration almost always phrases the argument in terms of, do you want this criminal here?
Mhm.
Uh, these are murderers. These are very bad people. We need to get rid of them.
Yes.
Instead of what is the appropriate, it would be like, I mean, we have people on trial right now that I'm fully convinced are probably murderers or the like. But
Legal or illegal
right, I mean,
citizens and
there's the
immigrants.
guy in
Mhm.
Nebraska who's being, tried or will soon be tried for, killing 5 college students, however many it
Exactly.
was. We're still going to give him due process. We're not going to
Yes.
assume. I mean, we we there's a strong presumption against him in a way, but legally he's still innocent. And the same
Exactly.
is true just because you say that someone is a member of a Venezuelan gang or they're this or that. We know historically that people are falsely accused of things.
Yes.
And particularly during times of hysteria or paranoia, in the 1950s, there are a lot of people labeled as communists who were not communist at all.
Right.
And
During the
so,
McCarthy era.
right, so we need to be very careful that we don't lose our own protections and our own freedoms in the goal of, somehow purifying our society or getting rid of everyone here who's illegally
Sure.
illegal. And, frankly, in my judgment, even someone who's been here illegally, if they've been here for 20 years and they have roots and family and they never committed a crime,
Right.
uh, I think there probably should be lesser penalties than deportation, particularly if it means breaking up a family. That's another,
Sure.
that's a legislative matter. Um, but and of course, I guess one of the things that bothers me here is that we see some further slippage, which is we're moving from people that we believe are here illegally and are
Mhm.
illegal immigrants. And now the argument is shifting to, and by the way, if you're born in the United States
Yes.
to somebody who may have been illegal, then maybe we can deport
You go
you too.
too. Hmm.
And, how far will it be before we get to, well, if you're born in the United States, maybe you're really not loyal to the United States, and maybe we ought to be able to get rid of you too. So it's a
Right.
slippery slope, banana peel, if you will, camel's nose in the tent.
Right.
But the rest of the camel doesn't necessarily follow, but one should be wary. Our forefathers certainly were. Uh,
Yeah.
you know, absolute power or power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, Lord Act.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. And so what I want to do with this due process, and we hear about it a lot with normal cases, what I would call criminal cases,
Sure.
right? Normal criminal cases. There are a lot of Supreme Court decisions, other court decisions of due process. We think about this with the right to trial, with the presumption of innocence, with the right to confront your accusers, the
Right to
right
an
to
attorney.
remain silent and have an attorney. So these are what we normally think of as due process. But I like that the Supreme Court, I'm jumping into the decision, but I think it's important to have this basis, is in this A.A.R.P, which is an initial, our initials for a specific person who's heading a class versus Donald Trump. This decision in May 16th, this Per Curiam decision actually they feel the need to describe due process. And this is when applying it to immigration. So they're not saying it's only for criminal cases. It's only for these types of people. They're using it in the application of all. And what they say is in here, this is on the third page, they're quoting other cases. So I won't do those, but know that in much of this, they're quoting. It says the Fifth Amendment. So they're going back to the same one that provides due process for criminal defendants. The Fifth Amendment entitles aliens to due process of law in the context of removal proceedings. Procedural due process rules are meant to protect against, and here's where you are, Dad, the mistaken or unjustified deprivation of life, liberty, or property. That's from a case in 78.
And so people will know that there's the due process clause in the Fifth Amendment applies
Mhm.
to actions by the national government. And that's mostly what we're dealing with when we deal with
Correct.
immigration. But there's also a due process clause in the 14th Amendment that limits the states. So this is a matter fundamental enough that it's actually repeated twice in the Constitution.
Right. And they
Once
make
for the
sure
federal
that,
government.
right, that it's not just the federal government, it's the states
Right.
have the requirement too. And so that was a 1978 case. And here's my favorite part of it. They refer back to a 1903 case. They say it's the Japanese immigrant case, is what it's called. So it's an actual immigration case from 1903. And this is the quote that they use. We have long held that, quote, no person shall be removed from the United States without opportunity at some time to be heard.
But
So
let me
that's
give
the
you
specifics for immigration.
you know, I'm not up on this maybe as much as I should be, but as far as I know, we can't even expel somebody from college without
Right.
giving them due process. Now you may have a rule that's, says you got to have a certain grade point average, but you can't
Of
just
course.
arbitrarily say, well, we don't think you belong here.
Mm.
You would have to give them,
Notice.
and yeah, due process.
Mhm.
Due
And
process is
here,
often in legal matters, well, the two are related, but procedural due process can often be as important as substantive due process.
and what's the
Well, in
difference?
other words, the outcome, it's not just yay or nay, it's how do you get there? Do you
And
get
that's the
there?
procedure part.
Right. Do you get there, following the proper procedure?
Right. And I think it's important to note that the Supreme Court isn't necessarily saying they can't be deported.
No,
They're
absolutely.
saying they have the right to the process. Where if you go through the process, they could still be removed under the normal process, but
Absolutely.
they have a right to the process.
Absolutely.
And in this case, especially for immigration and deportation cases, it requires, and they state this, due process requires notice that is reasonably calculated
Right.
under all the circumstances to apprise interested parties and that affords a reasonable time to make an appearance.
Right. So it means you can't round up, 100 people and claim that they're all gang members and send them back
Off
to
they go.
Venezuela or El Salvador the next day.
Right.
Because almost invariably you're going to end up, when you do a roundup like that, you're going to find somebody there who's a friend of somebody there who may not even
Yes.
know that they're a gang member. You may find
Right.
somebody who's not yet 16 years old, which I think it's 16 or 18 that they have to be before they're deportable under this particular regulation. So, if you believe that the government is always right, then you don't have to worry about due process. But if you
Right.
think there's ever a possibility that somebody could be falsely accused or falsely rounded up, then their, rights are related. If this can happen to
Mhm.
somebody else, it can happen to us.
Right. I mean, look at Abrego Garcia. The government is admitting they were wrong, that it was
Yeah,
basically
and
an
they've still left
administrative
him
error.
there.
And he's still there.
Yeah, which is an outrage.
So,
And there's a great article, and I can't remember if it was in Politico or New York Times this week, but urging the judge to enact civil contempt procedures. He can fine somebody $1,000 a day. He can take an official who's responsible, fine them $1,000 a day, and double it every day until they do it.
Hmm.
And frankly, the idea, particularly in that case, particularly where the government says, yes, we made a mistake, but we're not going to correct it.
Right.
Imagine this was a relative of yours. Oh, yeah, they're in a
Yes.
foreign prison. They don't belong there. And it's one of the world's worst, but too bad.
Oops.
Oops. Yeah.
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 Keep going back
Secretary of
to
State
that.
saying oops. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's the key here too, is what the court relies on in this per curiam decision is the fact that it is so immediate. And that's the word they keep going back to,
Well,
is the immediacy of
well,
the
and
removal.
remember, we had similar cases that we've talked about in the last couple of weeks where they purposely pick somebody up in New York, send them to
Bring them
New
to
Jersey, and the
Texas.
next thing you know, they're in Texas. And they seem to be doing it either to put them in a jurisdiction where they think a judge is favorable to them, or simply so people don't know which court to go to. So
Right.
you bring a case in New York and they say, oh, no, he's in New Jersey. You go to New Jersey and say, well, now he's in Texas. This is a shell game, and people ought to be
Yes.
able to figure it out. Now, what's frustrating is it almost appears as though the more immigration is in the news, the better Trump comes out, because people
Yeah.
elected him on anti-immigration. But again, rights rights are tied together.
Yes.
As you treat the least of these my brethren, you're going to end up treating other people the same way.
Exactly. And that's again this immediacy and imminency. That's
Right.
what you're also discussing, is
So,
what
so,
else is coming.
so maybe we can tie this then to this birthright citizenship
Well,
case.
yes, I want to, but hold that just another
Okay.
minute. We're gonna move there, but I want to finish this one because I think
Okay.
there are another few really important
Okay.
pieces in here.
You have the case in front of you, so.
I absolutely do. This one was really big to me. As you can tell, this one was the one that I really wanted to touch on today because of the due process issue and the ultimate holding. And that's what we haven't gotten to.
Right.
The ultimate holding, as this has gone to the second round of the Supreme Court, was the Supreme Court says all of these detainees stay for now. You cannot deport them. Didn't say forever.
Okay. Without due process.
But it says you cannot deport them without due process. They are issuing injunctive relief to these Venezuelans held in this Texas prison. And what it says is they're issuing temporary injunction relief in order to preserve our jurisdiction. And that's what we're talking about, is because if they get shipped off, Abrego Garcia isn't coming back. And they're saying, the government is saying, we no longer have jurisdiction over him because he's gone. So the Supreme
Which
Court
is
is
ridiculous, by the way.
absolutely.
But yes.
And the Supreme Court is saying, well, the government represented on the record that they were going to remove them after midnight. We found out that they were putting them on buses headed to the airport to be deported within hours, that they had just been picked up. And they're saying, look, this is so imminent. We have to act in order to preserve our ability to rule on the ultimate matter. And that's where we get into the concurrence. And this is what I like, and had a quite an interesting time with. And he's not saying which way he would go. And it's Kavanaugh, so I think I might know where he would go. But Kavanaugh says in his concurrence, okay, I'm not disagreeing with what the court's doing, but he says the circumstances call for a prompt and final resolution. I would prefer not to remand to the lower courts and further put this off. I would grant certiorari. Order prompt briefing, hold our oral arguments soon thereafter, and then resolve the legal issues. So he's saying, let's just go ahead and decide. Whereas even though the court is saying no more deportation under the Alien Enemies Act until the issue is resolved, but they first send it back to the district court saying, okay, we're sending it back to the district court, and here are the questions that you have to ask and resolve factually, is normal preliminary injunction factors and the issue of what notice is due. And Kavanaugh is saying, well, don't we already know these things? We know these things. Let's decide on it rather than sending it back to the district court to make factual findings while all of these people are pending, and all of these other cases. This isn't the only one.
Right.
All these other cases are pending. What are we going to do about the Alien Enemies Act? Can they be deported under this?
And the problem, so people will know, this is the law passed in a very troubled time in U.S. history. It was passed at the same time as the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Sedition Act being the classic case of overreach when it comes to suppressing freedom of speech.
Right.
But the Alien Enemies Act specifically gives the president authority in cases where there is a war and where the nation is invaded. And in such circumstances, due process, might need to be set aside temporarily.
Yeah.
But we do not have a declared war with Venezuela or
Right.
any other country that I know at the moment. And we haven't, if we haven't, I mean, you can call immigration an invasion, but the truth of the matter is, Trump has told us that he's already solved that problem, that the border is now closed. If there
Right.
was an invasion, it's no longer. And even during the time where this invasion
Mm.
was taking place, that if you go back to the dictionaries of the time, we all know what an invasion. The
Yes.
invasion is what Russia did to Ukraine, right?
Or
Or what
what's when
Hitler did to Poland.
exactly when
Uh,
Germany rolls through Poland
right,
with the
right.
Blitzkrieg or goes to France.
It's not desperate people in your society trying to find a better life for themselves. That is not an invasion. Now, it may have some bad consequences and good ones, but it's a real for for someone who for particularly for Republicans who say that they value the words of the Constitution and the words of the law, this is a stretch by any
Yes.
any imagination.
Exactly. Okay, so that's where we are. Now let's head over to birthright
Okay,
citizenship,
let's do it.
which is very similar because we're still looking at who has the right to be here and how do we determine who should be here and who shouldn't be.
Right.
Now, we've picked up this before. This is a pending case before the Supreme Court. This
Well, it's
one
been
has
argued.
right. It has not been decided,
Right.
but it
Right.
has been recently argued.
Right. And there are two main arguments. So the 14th Amendment was adopted after the Civil War. So you remember in the Dred Scott decision of 1857, the Supreme Court decided that African Americans could not be U.S. citizens. And the 13th Amendment, well, abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment decided that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens thereof. So it said that, and of their state as well, by the way. So
Mhm.
it predicated citizenship on birth in the United States,
Yeah,
or naturalization. I mean, there's another way to become a citizen, and that's what we hope. I think for many immigrants that ultimately, if they stay here, we hope that they seek citizenship,
sure.
and that they attain it. Now, what's fascinating about this argument is it's not clear that the court's going to decide it because what the court is concerned about, or what the primary arguments have to do with, so if you go to deport someone who is born of parents who were in the United States but were not citizens, can you deport them?
Right.
So a federal judge has said, absolutely not. I'm going to issue an injunction that applies all over the country. You cannot deport someone to another country if they were born in the United States. Now, here's
Right.
where you have this bizarre interpretation. So, generally, conservatives, among whom I often consider myself one, believe that you should interpret a text according to the plain words of the document.
Right.
All citizens born or naturalized in the United States, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, or citizens thereof. Now,
Right.
what the Trump administration does is they're trying to set the plain words of the document over against what they conceive to be its primary purpose. And
Sure.
they say the primary purpose was to deal with people who had been born into slavery in the United States. I don't think at the time it was even illegal. I don't think we had illegal aliens in the United States. I don't think there was a law prohibiting people from other countries from coming here. But they want to put they want to read an intent into the document that is not actually in the words.
Right.
Now, one way of doing this is to say, well, it says subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And if you're not a citizen of the United States, you're not subject to the jurisdiction. But if you want to take that argument, it would mean if you're an illegal alien and you murder somebody, you can't be arrested. If
Exactly.
somebody goes 100 miles down the highway, you can't stop them
Yes.
because they're not subject to the jurisdiction. So what
Right.
does subject to the jurisdiction mean? It seems as though it refers to diplomats. So if
Right.
you came to the United States as a couple, representing, say, Britain, and your son or daughter is born here, we would not consider them a U.S. citizen because they're
Correct.
still, right. Or if, and this I don't know was on their mind, but scholars have said, if the country were to be invaded by a foreign force and they had children as they were here,
Mm.
we would still consider them to be invaders. We're not going to give them the privilege of American citizenship
Right.
simply because their parents were here fighting against us.
Right.
But but what happens is, and here's where, neither side is being very consistent, because when Obama was president, when Biden was president, Republicans were screaming about how unfair it was. Right. Democrats were screaming that it was unfair that a single federal judge could block one of their policies. And
Right.
now Republicans are screaming, we don't think it's fair that a single federal judge should be able to do this. So but what's interesting is you had at least 3 or 4 justices, mostly on the liberal side, who during the arguments just said, well, isn't this such a clear case? It's clear what the 14th Amendment says.
Right.
What, and shouldn't, and one could argue, and here's what I think might happen, is I think the court might say, we don't know, or we're not going to decide today whether a federal judge should be able to issue an injunction that covers the whole United States. But in a case of citizenship, which requires some kind of national uniformity, perhaps this will be a case where they can. And
Yeah,
then just,
that's my hope, is at least rule on the birthright citizenship issue.
yeah, but I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure they're going to do that. But what's fascinating is when, and I believe it was Kavanaugh, who asked the Solicitor General, well, what would happen, to somebody today in these how are we going to decide? He didn't know. He didn't have a plan for, do we give them a hearing?
Right.
What kind of due process is due to them? And that's really scary, I think.
Exactly. It's this slippery slope that you're talking
And
about,
and
is
and,
what
and by the way, there's
documentation.
I think I may have misspoken before, because I think I gave you a different name, but it's U.S. versus Wom Kim A.A.R.P is an
Okay.
1898 case where a Chinese American, if I recall, may have been Japanese, but I believe Chinese. In any case, he had been born in the United States to parents who were not citizens. He went back to his home country and tried to come back, and the United States tried to deny it, and the court said no. Birthright citizenship includes all persons born in the United States.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. So that's where we are on that. And I wish I'd remembered
Oh,
exactly what the phrasing was, but there was an interesting exchange during the hearing between Justice Sotomayor
yes,
and one of the government attorneys,
yes,
and Justice Amy Coney Barrett got involved and essentially said, not specifically, but essentially said, how dare you talk to her that way? How dare you speak with her that way and make these arguments to this justice?
right.
Essentially, who are you and why would you talk to any of us or treat any of us this way? But I thought that was an interesting and fun little
So
exchange.
the other thing in this case that we haven't mentioned
Hmm.
is some of the justices seem to be suggesting almost like that instead of seeking an injunction, what they should have done is seek a class action suit.
Right.
But whether the final outcome, I mean, this is where maybe they're being a little too lawyerly. Maybe it doesn't really, when you ultimately have to make the same kind of decision, whichever one it's brought under.
I would think so, yes. And would it
But
apply to all? Mhm.
right. And do you expect, so if you leave it up to each individual, then we got real problems with equal protection, because not everyone is going to be equally situated to
Right.
find an attorney to challenge their expulsion.
Absolutely. And the other thing that I was considering with this slippery slope for the birthright citizenship is, what about those who were born to people who were lawfully here at the time under a
Right.
visa, a green card, or who were under or working toward the citizenship process, who then later became citizens but weren't at the time of their children's birth? Are those children subject to deportation
Well,
and are no longer citizens?
right. And the problem is, if you're born in the United States, you're issued a Social Security number.
Correct.
And some states now, if they decided you were no longer citizens, what happens when you move from one state to another? Uh,
Right.
it really is, we really don't want to, I mean, I don't particularly care whether this is decided by an injunction or whether it's decided by a class action, but 14th Amendment is one of the high points of American law. Hadn't always been
Absolutely.
enforced very well. Um, but the recognition of equal protection for all and due
Yes.
process for all, and we start now trying to distinguish, who was born to what parent in the United States. It's almost like the old legitimacy categories. In my judgment, there are no illegitimate children. There may be
Right.
illegitimate parents, but it's not the child's fault.
Well,
Um,
let me even put a scarier analogy. Are we looking for the Aryan race? Is that what we're trying to
Well,
do?
I mean, that's another fairly interesting development that's happening is at a
South
time where we
Africans.
are, at a time where we're throwing out or building walls, who are we accepting? We're accepting
Other white people.
Afrikaners. We're accepting people, and you know,
Only the white ones. We're
right,
only accepting South Africans who are white.
right now, and again, one might be able to make a humanitarian argument on their behalf. I think it's fairly weak at present, but you know, I'm not opposed to accepting white people into the United States,
Sure.
but it sure looks very suspicious that they're the one, at a time where Afghans who fought on our side and risked their lives are being threatened with deportation.
Right.
Ukrainians, whom we have supported over the past years, are being threatened with deportation. We're going to accept white Afrikaners. Well, I think just
It,
shows sort of where the direction is here.
it certainly looks like a racist agenda.
It
I'll say
does.
that, because it looks like we're trying to get rid of and prevent any persons of color from coming into or staying in our country. So that's a concern, and I just wanted to raise it because it seems very disturbing and upsetting to me. As are we going to be again? Let's just replace. I've said this
Well,
before. Replace
we
the
traditionally have been bound together by a commitment to the principle that all men are created equal.
exactly.
Not, I mean, yes, we've had a racial identity through most of our history, but we've always said, we were the place that accepted people from all over. We would take the refuse of the old world and give them opportunities here.
The melting pot.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
Let's talk a little
so
bit about airplanes.
yes, I
We
would
have a great
love to talk
aerospace
about that.
program at MTSU.
You do one of the very best in the
We
United
do, and we're
States.
we're building a new, I think, $60 million facility in a nearby place so that we get people from all over the country who come here for aerospace. But I know that the runway in Murfreesboro, I'm not sure about the new one in Shelbyville, but I'm pretty sure the one in Murfreesboro will not accept the 747.
I
So
don't
it
think
may
so.
be that if the president would want to come visit, now he probably can come to Nashville and do so on this plane that Qatarians are giving him. It's apparently only worth about $400 million,
Only.
only about 400 million. It would be the largest gift ever given to an American president. And there is a specific concern in the Constitution about this. Article 1, Section 9. Article 1, by the way, deals with the powers of Congress. Article 1(8) gives the powers of Congress. Article 1(9) limits the powers. And in Clause 8 says that no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States. No person holding any office or of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of Congress, accept any present, emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state. We want the President of the United States devoted solely to the interest of the United States.
Okay, now let me pause there.
Yes,
If this is under Article 1
right.
regarding congressional limits and powers,
Mhm.
how are we getting something that's affecting the president?
Well, this says it actually goes wider. I mean, it would apply to members of Congress, but it applies to no person holding any office of profit or trust under them, under the United States.
Okay,
So
so
that
that's
clear,
how it expands
right? It includes the president, and it doesn't prohibit a gift, but it does require congressional consent.
to
And Frank,
receive a gift.
pardon, to
To
receive a
receive a
gift, and
gift.
and I mean literally. uh, I know in many government offices, you're told, you can't take anything. You can't even accept a meal sometimes.
It's seen as a bribe.
Exactly. And Trump's argument seems to be that it's not a bribe because I'm doing it above the table. But you could say the same about a bank robber, right?
Sure.
I'm doing it in the opening. I'm pointing at a gun at you and giving you a choice. That's probably a little extreme. Um, but I mean, this stinks, frankly. If
It,
and
oh,
if
it's terrible.
if somebody doesn't think it stinks, just put it on the other foot.
If Biden were
Biden went
doing
over,
this,
if Obama went over, if Clinton went over and accepted a $400 million plane, which, by the way, apparently would require hundreds of millions of dollars to debug, possibly,
to alter it,
the alter it, make sure that everything is safe. And I mean, are we a poor enough country that we got to get a plane from a foreign potentate in order to fly our president around? I mean,
right?
it's
I
and
mean,
I really don't think Congress is going.
but that's the thing is under this clause, Congress has to approve it
That's right.
if it's even accepted.
That's right.
And we're calling it's called the Emoluments Clause. And I hear the word emoluments in there, but what is an emolument?
It's basically it's a gift, a payment of whatever. Yeah,
I
it's
mean,
it's
we don't even allow, I mean, there are so many rules where we can't give other, like we're saying, these potential bribes. There are these specific rules, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that prohibit us from taking anything from Russia, from different African states
well.
where
And
I
by the
had
by the way,
colleagues.
what are the three causes that somebody can be impeached?
High crimes, misdemeanors,
Okay,
and
and
treason.
treason, and one more.
Well, you said three. I
I
picked
did.
three.
Well, okay, the one phrase is considered one, okay? High crimes and misdemeanors, so four if you want to count
Oh,
them
okay.
two, okay? Bribery. Bribery. Now, you know,
What's the quid pro quo?
well, what do you
What is
think? I
Qatar
mean,
looking for?
okay, this is a regime that has supported Hamas. So, which doesn't mean that they should we should never try to reconcile or work things out with them. But how does it look? Does it pass the smell test? No, it doesn't. At least
No, I mean, I don't know that we would even think that accepting one from Britain would be okay. Or our other
well,
known
actually,
allies
in
or
the beginning of
prior
World War
allies.
II, we had an interesting situation where Britain needed our ships, and Roosevelt couldn't figure out a way to give it to him, and so he traded them for American bases, which did
Right.
ultimate.
But
Uh,
that's a trade.
yeah,
That's a
no,
trade, not an acceptance of a gift. And normally these gifts of are usually some type of a firearm or war, weapon of
okay.
war is
Well, and
even the
gifts to president. I mean,
Ukrainians.
we've actually had two presidents, if I remember, who received baby elephants from like India or something as a gift, or you would give them some, you give them maybe Trump could be giving signed Bibles. I don't know if
Oh
he signs the
gosh.
Quran. That would be an interesting.
No, only the Bible with the Constitution and other American
Yeah.
documents.
Anyway, I mean, they would be the typical kind of. I'm exaggerating a little, but that would be the kind of typical. They would be a symbolic kind of gift.
But that
You
would
know,
also go in like the National Zoo. It's not like
yeah.
he keeps it in the backyard of the White
Right.
House for
Well,
himself.
and this, right. What's particularly weary about this one is it appears it would be given to him for immediate use, but then would go to his library. Now, to be fair, one could argue that both sides have played this game. He's just taken it to a new level. So the Clinton Foundation collected hundreds of million, well, I believe over $150 million after Clinton retired from the president to carry on, various work of his. Once Hillary Clinton was defeated for president, the amount of money that they've gotten has been very little.
Right.
People, and we have the same thing, by the way. The more obvious concern in my book, a plane, at least you know what's there.
Yeah.
That when you do cryptocurrency,
Mm.
and memes and these kind of things that are so, who knows, somebody deposits $1 billion in one of these, and
From
who
which
knows,
country?
right, who knows what they're expecting in return for this.
Right. Is it a foreign government who's
Right.
doing this? Is it
And
another
again, it's not
country?
unique to Trump. Does anybody believe that Hunter Biden's paintings were worth
Oh,
what, the hundreds of thousands of dollars that he was
heavens
trying to
no.
charge for them?
No.
It was a way of you buy the son's paintings, and then, hopefully the father will look favorably upon.
Right. The influence.
But this is just dirty business. I mean,
Absolutely.
it's not appropriate.
Well,
Uh,
I saw one of my favorite pieces on this is there, and I wish I remembered their names. I watch them all the time, but there's a couple that graduated from Harvard Law School. And she's really short and he's really tall, and they're just adorable, but they're very, very intelligent. And they do a lot on TikTok. And I saw them do a quick minute or two segment about this, and I thought they were spot on with their mention of, does it actually violate the law? Well, it violates the Constitution, but there's no penalty for it. There's no actual, with most laws, there's a penalty, right?
right.
If you do this, then this happens to you. But what they did say is, look, and this is to your point, Dr. Vile, of the biggest piece of it with the Emoluments Clause is it goes toward impeachment. It goes towards this high crimes and misdemeanors
Right.
and bribery. That's where it goes, which isn't necessarily for the president, not necessarily a criminal offense, but it could be an impeachable offense. Now, I don't know that anybody would go there with the Congress that we have, but that was their point of, look, if this happens, or if he continues to press this, then that could be considered by Congress under this law and under impeachment as a form of bribery for him
Right.
to be impeached on and be removed from office. But that was about the best that anybody can do. And I hope that there's at least this, that the legislature doesn't, give up their hands and say, well, he can do whatever he wants, that they'll actually use their powers to review the gift and refuse it. But it also is concerning to me that there was at least a suggestion, and honestly, I don't know how true it is. So please don't quote me on this, and I'm not trying to do any kind of defamation. But there's at least been a suggestion made that Trump actually requested the gift first and then was offered
and I
it.
don't know on that.
So I don't know, but I don't know which is more concerning, honestly. And again, I think the underlying this doesn't smell good is, to me, it's the underlying what's under the table. What deal has been made under the table? What handshake deal is, you give me this, I'll do this? Are we now defending Qatar? Are we now supporting Hamas? What's the quid pro quo of, we're going to give you this battleship, I'll give you bases.
Okay,
There's
so I want to
normally
throw you a
something
new one.
expected. Oh,
Let's talk
wow.
about the Pope a minute, okay?
Oh, please. Yes.
Okay, because I have an article out for people who
The new
follow
Pope
me.
or the prior Pope?
The current Pope,
Current Pope. Okay.
14th. If people go to the First Amendment Encyclopedia, I posted an article, I believe, on the 12th about the new Pope. And what's interesting is there was an early debate about something similar. So when the Constitution, one of the other provisions in the Constitution, I believe it's in Article 6, it prohibits what are known as test oaths. Federal office, no one can be forced to affirm that they're Protestant, that they believe in God, that they're Presbyterian or Anglican or Methodist or whatever. And during the debates over the ratification of the Constitution, there were some people, some of the anti-federalists, were very concerned about this. They said, if we're not careful, we're going to end up with a Catholic Pope. I'm sorry, a Catholic president.
Oh,
Or,
Catholic
right.
Pope. I would hope
Catholic
so.
Pope. Yeah, that would be awful. Okay.
Sorry, you got me on that one.
No, that was good. Okay. So, what would keep a Catholic from becoming president or a Muslim from becoming president? And James Erdell in the North Carolina Convention, Erdell later became a Supreme Court justice. He said, this is the most absurd argument I've ever heard. Basically, he said, first of all, the country is so predominantly Protestant that it's hard to imagine this would happen. Right. So, one of the arguments was that the Pope might run for the presidency. And he said, so you're telling me that somebody in the United States would go over to Rome, get an education, become Pope, and then run for president? He just laughed it off. And here I find, as a youngster, I was an underachiever.
You set the bar too low.
I wanted to be president of the United States. Obviously, well, that didn't happen except when I donned my James Madison suit. But this guy wanted to be Pope. He told people at 10 years old that he was going to be Pope one day.
Yeah.
Now, what's the likelihood that having achieved popedom, that he would also want to be president of the United States? And since, he has a longer term as Pope, right?
Potentially.
Pardon?
Potentially. It's
well,
death.
There's no term limit for a Pope.
Right.
There are for presidents. But it is sort of interesting. First now, and people are getting this wrong. They're saying he's the first American Pope. No, he's the first North American born Pope.
Correct.
The last Pope was also from South America. And this Pope, by the way, has dual citizenship in the United States and Peru. But what is fascinating is, this Pope seems to be following his predecessor in cautioning against how we treat immigrants.
Right.
And the poor, and at a time where our foreign policy, some people think maybe we put more emphasis on human rights abroad than we did
Mm.
on our own personal interests. I
Sure.
get that. But I think that America is best when it is seen as striving for something bigger than itself. And if all we're known for is we're going to have the best deals in the world, we're going to be the richest country in the world, I think we're going to be spiritually and politically impoverished. I
Right.
would much rather stand for human rights abroad than I would stand for having the highest tariffs
Right.
or, the highest, even the highest employment or lowest inflation. These are all good goals, but that we didn't write the Declaration of Independence in order that America would be the biggest and the best financially. We wrote it
Right.
because we were going to be a country that treated people with equal respect and equal dignity and gave
Correct.
human rights to everybody. And I
And
think we're
gave
really,
power to a cross section rather than just one person.
that's right. And the notion that we seem to be basing our, policy between Russia and Ukraine on which one can give us rare earth materials rather than on who was the aggressor and who was the victim
Right.
just seems so, and my very mixed feelings about Woodrow Wilson and people who, thought that we were going to go out and dominate the world,
Right.
with American ideals.
And I swear I'm not laughing
No,
about this theory. I'll
no,
come back to that. I'm laughing about another reason that you were
no,
mentioning, but
no,
please
right. You
continue.
once asked me what I thought about Woodrow Wilson, and I gave you a 2-hour lecture
Oh
on.
my goodness. It was truly one of the funniest times in my life. And I remember even where I was sitting, where we were, where I was in college and I was in somebody else's class. I think I was in Dr. Burns' class on the US presidency, and we were studying Woodrow Wilson. And of course, I decided to ask you, oh, hey, what do you think about Woodrow Wilson? And I'm here trying to study for a test. And you're like, well, let me tell you about Woodrow Wilson. And I think the next few words were he was the most egocentric something something something. And I was like, wow, that was definitely not what I was expecting. And about 2 hours later, we finished. So yes, you have very strong opinions about Woodrow
But the good
Wilson.
side of Wilson was he did, whether we should have been trying to impose it on the rest of the world, certainly questionable. But he had ideals. He
Yes.
understood that America stood for, spiritual might not be the right word because we don't have religious tests for office, but we support values traditionally that why do we have an immigration problem instead of an immigration problem? Because people want to come here.
They
Now,
want our
some of them,
democracy.
some of them come here because they think they're going to make more money here, but a lot of them come here because they know that they're going to be able to exercise their religious freedom. They know they're going to
Right.
be able to speak their minds. They know that they're not going to have to worry about a knock on the door in the middle of the night with armed thugs carrying them off to prison and deporting them.
Exactly.
And to the extent that we lose, we can make the country miserable enough that the immigration will take care of itself. Nobody's going
We'll
to
all move
come
out.
here. But we should be, to go back to John Winthrop, and there's many problems with this too, but this notion that we should be a city on a hill. We should be, it's not that we
The
should be
light.
imposing our will on others, but we should be an exemplar of the kind of countries that other people would want to be and
A
want to
light, a
aspire
beacon of
to.
hope.
Right.
Exactly. And we used to be fighting wars for democracy to help and have
Well,
other
right now,
countries
yeah,
use
that's before we
democracy.
needed rare earth materials, apparently.
Exactly.
By the way,
So,
there's one term I'm gonna quiz you on
oh no.
because
Oh no, this never turns out well.
I've noticed the last 2 or 3 cases of import, the term ultra, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right, ultra vires or ultra virus, VIRES.
It's
This has
definitely a
been a
legal
major
Latin
argument in
term.
2 or 3 cases that the argument is that the president's actions are ultra vires,
Is that above the law?
beyond the law or
Ah!
contrary to law.
Oh, I was so close.
Yeah, yeah. In other
Okay.
words, it exceeds presidential authority.
Mm.
And that's what a lot of it's about. In my, it was a time during particularly early 60s when mostly liberals, but others too, were very concerned about what they call the imperial presidency. And we have never had a president, in my judgment, who has taken the imperial presidency any further than the current one. You see that, he's fired the head of the Library of Congress. He's replaced the Kennedy Center.
Yes.
In a case that there's one other case that we were going to mention, he's dismantled the U.S. Institute for Peace.
Correct.
Hundreds of employees have
Mhm.
been fired. And there was just a district court this week that said this is ultra vires. This is beyond the president's authority. And the argument, by the way, was that, and we've talked about this before, the Constitution gives most appointments are made by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate.
Correct.
So the question then becomes who can remove officers? And the general rule is the president can remove without senatorial authority. Myers versus United States established
But
that.
isn't that usually based on misconduct?
Typically, right. But there are cases, this case known as Humphrey's Executor, where the court has ruled that if an agency is primarily judicial in nature or quasi-judicial or quasi-legislative, that the president doesn't have the same power to fire without cause. And this comes, according to this district court judge in U.S. District of Columbia, the president when the U.S. Institute of Peace was established right after World War II, it was established basically to investigate and promote peace throughout the world. It was created in some ways independent of both. Well, it's been appropriated by Congress ever since. And it's not, according to this decision, it's not an executive agency. And so the president's power to fire members of the executive, good or bad, are not really questioned. But if it's a non-executive branch or department, his powers are more limited. So this is going to be a very fascinating case to watch.
Absolutely. And while we're sitting on pins and needles for all of these cases that we've discussed and even more that we haven't, take a look at them, investigate, review them on your own. This is the power of freedoms, of the right to free speech and free press and assembly is find your own opinion and express it. You can certainly express them here, like, subscribe, submit, comment. Again, we're happy with those who don't even agree with us, but please keep it respectful. That's all that we ask. We don't love name calling and we don't love curse words, that sort of thing, but please feel free to drop your opinion underneath. And also check out www.thelawunscripted.com. That's our company that supports and hosts the Legal Weekly Wine. And on there, you can find some bar-related classes for those who are coming up to taking the bar, especially this summer. We've got the July bar coming up very soon. So you can find classes for the core 8 subjects for law school, including the constitutional law, criminal law, torts, etc. So you can find those classes. And for those who aren't studying for the bar, check out our merchandise. We have some fun shirts. We have some fun coffee tumblers. Check those out, purchase those for yourselves, and we will catch you next time on the Legal Weekly Wine.